In the late 1980s, Milwaukee, Wisconsin was a city that still held on to its working-class roots. Factories and breweries lined its industrial heart. Neighborhoods were filled with families who had lived in the same houses for decades, and most people believed that while crime existed, it belonged to another part of town, another kind of life. Milwaukee was not a place people thought of when they thought of serial murder. That would change. Between 1987 and 1988, the city would live under the shadow of fear as an unremarkable man named Robert Wirth began slipping into homes, preying on the elderly and leaving behind a trail of devastation. It was a series of crimes so senseless, so brutal, that even seasoned detectives would later admit the case haunted them long after it was closed. Robert Wirth was not a figure who drew attention. Born in Wisconsin in 1959, he blended easily into the backdrop of Milwaukee's neighborhoods. He wasn't charming, he wasn't accomplished, and he wasn't the kind of man anyone would look at twice on the street. But there was something beneath the surface, a darkness that fed on opportunity, resentment, and violence. By his late 20s, Wirth had drifted into a life without direction. He had no remarkable career, no close circle of friends, and no future to speak of. What he did have was anger, and in 1987, that anger found a target. The first known attacks seemed almost random. An elderly woman would be found in her home, brutally beaten. Another would be strangled. For detectives, the crimes were alarming, but at first there was no clear pattern, no obvious connection. Milwaukee was not unused to violence, but these were different. These were invasions, deliberate attacks carried out against some of the most vulnerable in the city. Doors had been forced, belongings rifled through, lives ended with shocking cruelty. And yet, each scene seemed to leave behind little evidence. It was as if the killer simply vanished back into the night. But Robert Wirth could not remain invisible forever. His methods left scars, and his arrogance left clues. In one of the most bizarre and haunting details of the investigation, a toy donkey was found at the scene of a murder. At first it seemed meaningless, a child's trinket left behind in the wrong place. But when investigators traced it, they discovered it belonged to a family member of one of Wirth's earlier victims. It was evidence that he had not only killed, but taunted, leaving behind a grotesque calling card in the form of an innocent toy. By 1988, the city was on edge. Elderly residents double-locked their doors, neighborhoods formed watch groups, and whispers spread of a predator stalking the streets. Police began to quietly admit to the press that they believed a serial killer was at work. And behind it all was Robert Wirth, moving through the city with unsettling calm, choosing his targets, breaking into their homes, and ending their lives. His victims were frail, often defenseless, and the brutality he inflicted seemed unnecessary even by the standards of murder. Stabbings, beatings, strangulation, Wirth didn't simply kill, he punished. It was chance that finally broke the case. In mid-1988, Wirth was arrested during an armed robbery of a taxi driver. When police searched him, they discovered he was carrying a handgun. That handgun, it turned out, had been stolen from the home of one of his murder victims. Suddenly, the vague suspicions, the whispers of detectives, and the mounting fear crystallized into a solid case. Forensic testing and witness statements began to close the net around him. And then there was the toy donkey, a piece of evidence so strange and so damning that it tied Wirth to the killings beyond question. Interrogating Robert Wirth was, by all accounts, a chilling experience. Detectives later recalled the coldness in his responses. He denied some of the crimes, admitted to others in roundabout ways, and spoke with a detachment that suggested he did not grasp the magnitude of what he had done, or worse, that he simply didn't care. There were no tears, no apologies, no flickers of remorse. He spoke as though describing something that had happened to someone else, not something he himself had carried out. The trial that followed was one of the most disturbing Wisconsin had ever seen. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece: the elderly victims who had been targeted in their own homes, the brutality of the attacks, the stolen belongings, the toy donkey, and the gun found in his possession. They showed the jury how Wirth had not acted in panic or desperation, but with deliberate cruelty, using violence against those least able to defend themselves. The defense tried to argue he was unstable, that his mind was fractured, that he could not fully comprehend his actions. But the jury was unmoved. They saw him for what he was, a predator who had chosen the weakest among them and destroyed lives without hesitation. Throughout the proceedings, Wirth sat largely expressionless. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, clutching photographs of mothers and grandmothers, listening as prosecutors described how their loved ones had died. Each detail was like reopening a wound, and each time they looked toward Wirth, they saw no remorse, no recognition of their pain. He smirked occasionally, whispered to his lawyers, but never gave them the one thing they wanted, a sign that he understood what he had done. In the end, Robert Wirth was convicted and sentenced to 4 life terms plus 20 years. It ensured that he would never again walk free, never again slip through the darkness of Milwaukee to find another victim. He was sent to Oshkosh Correctional Institution, where he remains, a reminder of the violence he once inflicted on the city. But for the families, there was no true sense of closure. Justice, yes. Safety, yes. But closure? That was impossible. The lives he ended could never be restored. The terror he spread could never be undone. For Milwaukee, the case of Robert Wirth was a scar. It was a reminder that evil can exist where you least expect it. Wirth was not a famous man, not a figure who drew attention, not someone whose name carried weight until it was attached to murder. He lived quietly, unremarkably, until the moment he chose to unleash the rage within him. And then he became unforgettable. Even now, decades later, his story is told not for who he was, but for what he did. The elderly of Milwaukee, those who lived through those years, remember the fear of locking their doors tight at night, of glancing through curtains at every strange noise, of wondering if they might be next. And the families who lost mothers, grandmothers, sisters, and daughters will never forget. Their grief is the true legacy of Robert Wirth. What makes his case so chilling is not only the violence itself, but the coldness with which he carried it out. He killed without reason, without passion, without remorse. He was not driven by money, though he stole. He was not driven by need, though he broke into homes. He was driven by something deeper, something darker, a need to control, to hurt, to destroy. That is what makes Robert Wirth stand out among killers. The emptiness at his core, an emptiness that consumed others before it consumed him. Today, Robert Wirth's name sits among the long and terrible list of American killers. But in Wisconsin, he is more than a name on a list. He is a shadow that once fell over the city, a reminder of nights when even the safest neighborhoods felt unsafe, when even the strongest locks felt flimsy, and when evil walked quietly among ordinary people. He remains locked away, his life reduced to the slow passage of years behind prison walls. But the damage he did between 1987 and 1988 will never fade. For those who lived through it, for those who lost loved ones, and for those who investigated the crimes, the memory of Robert Wirth will always remain chilling, unrepentant, and unforgettable.